So now in the afternoon we have 3 talks on different issues, but around the theme, of course, of autonomy and governance of institutions. And we start with Rosemary Deem, again a long life colleague. I'm very happy that she's here with us. Rosemary is a sociologist, an academician of the Academy of Social Sciences, honorary fellow of the Society for Research into Higher Education, and member of the Peer Review College of the European Science Foundation, and co-convener of the Higher Education Network in the European Educational Research Association. She was appointed OBE, that is Order of the British Empire, which among others rewards contributions to the arts and sciences, in the Queen's Birthday Honours List in 2013, and received an honorary doctorate in literature from the University of Leicester in 2014. She has been a member of several UK research assessment exercise subpanels on education, and from 2015 to 2018, she was the first woman chair to the UK Council for Graduate Education. She's coordinating editor of Higher Education, we're part of the same team, and sits on the editorial board of Higher Education Quarterly and Studies in Higher Education. Her main research interest focuses on policy in and leadership, governance and management of higher education, doctoral education, the changing purposes and roles of universities, public service organizations, leadership and change agency, inequality in educational settings, notions of public good in higher education settings. So quite a diverse set of interests. So this work draws on organizational theory, feminist theory, policy analysis, new managerialism, and comparative social science. And today she's going to talk about new public management, managerialism, network governance, so different modes of governance in higher education.
Thank you. So, good afternoon. I'm going to talk about new managerialism. I'm going to talk about new public management, which is the thing I was asked to talk about, but I'm also going to talk about some other things, particularly networked governance and the difference between institutional autonomy and governance autonomy. So that's what I'm going to focus on. So new managerialism is something that, let's just... is something that's kind of, well, some people think it started in the 80s, some people think it started in the 1990s, and it's something that happened both in the global north and in the global south, where it was imposed by various kinds of organizations. Now, obviously what it did was to introduce things that maybe weren't there before or develop them more, so things like corporate management, corporate values, corporate practices, and the inevitable search for kind of something that was more efficient and effective, although I don't think those words describe higher education particularly well. A lot of emphasis on management for its own sake, on things like performance management and target setting and so on. And the new approach, well, it isn't new anymore, but it was new at one time, encouraged much more reliance on external stakeholders, so that's obviously very relevant to what we're talking about. It helped to reshape kind of the visions that institutions had of themselves and their strategies, and also emphasised in some systems a lot about marketisation of higher education, which of course not all systems have. And meanwhile, there was something else that was going on as well, which I think is linked to new managerialism and new public management, which is networked governance. But it's a concept that doesn't seem to be used that often. And I actually think it's quite important, because what it refers to is the architecture of governance. And Boyne talked about that this morning quite a bit in terms of the relationships between different layers and so on. And I think it's quite useful for thinking about that. And new management and new managerialism gave higher education managers more autonomy, whilst also encouraging universities to look a bit like businesses, even if they weren't, rather than emphasising things in the public realm so much. But as we will see, institutional autonomy doesn't necessarily mean you also have governance autonomy. And what happened under new managerialism is that people like heads of department in higher education institutions found themselves somewhat of a dilemma, because a lot of them didn't want to be managers in the first place, and they either were told to do it, or it was their turn, or they kind of felt that they should because somebody worse might do it. And that, of course, is very different to those people at a very senior level who generally have chosen to be at that level. What's interesting is how people have developed that concept of new managerialism, because some people talk about it as something, like Sue Shepherd talks about it as an ideal type. I don't actually think it is an ideal type, because that suggests something that's kind of static, whereas I actually think it continually shifts. And some people think of sort of different stages. You know, there was a corporate stage, there was a kind of neoliberal stage, then there's perhaps a kind of more technocratic stage, which is what Reed talked about. Other authors have identified different types of new managerialism. So Morales and Viega et al. Have talked about soft managerialism and hard managerialism. And finally, I think that institutional autonomy and governance offer quite an interesting thing to look at through new managerialism, but I'm not convinced that it tells you the whole story. And so I think it's quite complicated. And one of the things I'm going to look at is the European Universities Association exercise where they look at institutional autonomy across a range of characteristics, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So what's the difference between new managerialism and new public management? Well, I think they're quite similar in some ways, but I think there's probably two things that stand out. Is that, well, firstly, there's the whole question about how ideological the concept was. So I think new managerialism was more ideological initially than new public management, but I think that's probably not really the case anymore. It's used so widely that I don't think it has any ideological implications. But also, new public management relies a lot on public choice theory, which was seen by some people as a kind of positive factor. But it was also about making institutions like universities much more kind of marketized than they previously were. So there is a connection between them. And I think that both of them were kind of introduced sometimes by governments, sometimes by people working in the institutions themselves, sometimes from people coming in from other public organizations. I guess one other difference is possibly that new public management was studied a lot in lots of different public services, including hospitals. I think new managerialism has been studied in those organizations, but higher education and education in general have been much more the focus of it. So that's another difference. So I think that both theories are kind of helpful. They're also kind of consistent with notions of what is called boardism. And there's kind of two interesting things in this presentation. So there are two words that are not translatable very easily into Portuguese. One is boardism, which is the notion of kind of having external people on board who become more important than anyone else in the organisation. And the other one is managerialism, which also doesn't translate very well into Portuguese. Now, I'm responsible for the first one, but I'm not responsible for boardism. So that was a Portuguese invasion, so I can't take the rap for that particular one. But that's kind of one of the interesting things, I think. And boardism also talks about how external stakeholders might be viewed by the people who are heads of institutions, and the kind of shift from what is called imaginary or non-interfering friends into effective actors, or possibly, and this is not in the theory, people who are a damn nuisance, but they keep turning up to the meetings. So that, I think, is an important thing to hold on to, because that's very consistent with trends in different countries in terms of governance. But there's also this notion of networked governance, which is often, I think, overlooked in this analysis, but I think it's quite compatible with both new managerialism and new public management. And networked governance, as Janet Newman in her 2004 and 2005 publications notes, blurs organisational boundaries of governance. So it's not clear where the internal bits are, where the external bits are, how much of it's public, how much of it's private. But it does feed into decision-making processes. And it tends to have quite a complex array of different groups and committees and boards. And one of the things that I think is important is to consider there isn't a particular type of network governance which goes with new public management and new managerialism, because it's produced several different variants, and it may depend on who's actually calling the shots in terms of the governance regimes, and also what they are trying to achieve. So that typically you might have something like a board of trustees somewhere, you might have a council, you might have a senate or an academic board, you might have various kinds of committees that specialise in different things. Some of those would be things that the governors were very much part of, others might not be. But equally important, I think, is how external stakeholders are actually chosen and by whom, so that what they do and how they do it and how often they need to meet and so on are actually related also to the diversity of their membership. Now, it's interesting that if you look at different countries, some countries don't tell you anything about the diversity of people on governing boards. Others give you quite a lot of detail about that. But in general, I think they're not terribly diverse, and that I think has continued to be an issue. But also accountability to whom for what is a very important aspect of networked governance. And it can be quite ambiguous and complicated to work with, because the different committees don't always, and groups don't always link as neatly as they might, and there may be different perceptions at different levels about how important each of those are. If we then move on to this question about institutional autonomy versus institutional governance, I mean, I think that is an important distinction, because I think people may assume that because an institution appears to have autonomy, it also has governance autonomy. But that isn't necessarily the case. And that's a very, very important thing to hold in your head about this whole debate, it seems to me. So the institutional autonomy really refers to the extent to which institutions can set their own objectives and manage their activities without government interference. And that is quite important because if you don't make the separation between those two, it's actually quite hard to understand what's going on, because if you think that those two things automatically go together, you may actually be misled by certain kinds of explanations and collections of data. And I think it's particularly important to kind of look at those in a concrete context. So if you look at, for example, the Portuguese higher education system, then it's been built around allowing higher education institutions to have some institutional autonomy over areas like standards, curriculum and research, but everything else is determined by government. In other European countries, for example, England, which is still in Europe even though it's not in the EU, I just need to remind you, because we remind people of this from time to time, that what has happened there is that there's been much more autonomy for institutions of higher education over things like student selection and recruitment, staff salaries, staff appointments, promotion, dismissal, the right to borrow money, the right to generate and accumulate income and so on. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it has autonomy in every field. So one of the things I used was the European University Association does this autonomy scorecard about every 6 or 7 years. And it's based on a set of concepts. So one is organisational, leadership, academic structures, creating legal entities, governing bodies. The second is financial, so that's allocation of public and other funding, whether you can borrow money, things like whether you own the lands and buildings of your institution, whether students make financial contributions, and if so, what they're like. Staffing is things about like recruitment, promotion, appointments, dismissals. Academic is about things like overall student numbers, admission mechanisms, introduction and closure of programs, capacity to choose the language in which you teach, things like quality assurance mechanisms and the capacity to design your own study content rather than be told how to do it by somebody else. So if you look at this particular combination. So I'm going to compare England and Portugal, which you may think is strange, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, if you look at the organisational and the financial placings for the 2 years, 2011-2017, you can see that Portugal is behind UK, but not significantly so. Whereas if you look at staffing and you look at academic criteria, then it is a long way behind. But I think that actually masks something else that's going on there. And I think it raises all sorts of questions, which go beyond the question of kind of who these governors are. You know, are these external stakeholders still imaginary friends, or are they really effective actors, or are they something in between, or do they behave in both ways depending on what you're discussing, which I think is an experience that often occurs to people. So if we then move on to the comparison between Portugal and the UK. So there are huge differences between the systems. One system is quite small, the other is very, very large. I'm mostly going to talk about England because, as you probably know, the UK has 4 different higher education systems, although many people seem to think we've only got one. And if you look at system size, if you look at the extent of different modes of new public management and new managerialism, if you look at governance models, if you look at, sorry, that's the wrong one. If you look at things like whether they can choose to appoint their own staff, whether they can have a big impact on academic life or not, then there are some very big differences. I think until very recently, the English system was seen as one that had a huge amount of autonomy. It comes top or almost top in both of those studies that I just showed you from the EUA. And the assumption was that this was a system which was fairly autonomous, and universities actually were able to choose a great deal of what they chose to do, unlike in Portugal, where that was much more constrained. There have been some significant changes to the Scottish system as well, but I think to some extent the Scottish National Party, which has done that, actually got to a stage where it had to actually negotiate with the universities, because the universities were saying, we don't want, for example, the chairs of their governing bodies to be elected from a public election, because we don't think that's very helpful, and lots of people who are good at this and really committed to it are not going to stand if that happens. So I think in terms of its overall effect, although it looked dramatic, it's nothing like what has happened in England. Now, from 2012 onwards in England, when almost all government higher education teaching funding was cut completely, just almost overnight. So all the kind of money that had gone into funding teaching just suddenly disappeared. There were fees already, but they weren't massively high until that point. Meant that a whole new phase of kind of how the English system was working began to be introduced. So you begin to get student loans, which are very, very high levels. They keep changing the interest rates. They gradually sell on bits of the debt. So that means that you don't actually know over your lifetime what the actual interest rates will be the whole of the time that you owe that debt. And that was also, at the same time, there was this thing called the Teaching Excellence Framework, which was first mentioned, I think, in 2014 to 15, and then in the 2015 election, when the Conservatives won, then this was a big plank of their manifesto. So that's when something started to actually develop in the English system, which suggests that there was something sinister going in here, that despite that autonomy, which was still there in 2017, although we're talking about a slightly earlier period, that actually something was going in a very different direction from what had happened before. Now, what a comparison of the two systems shows is it's not just legal changes or theories that matter to governance autonomy, but also the view of politicians, political decisions, and how quality assurance of teaching is carried out. So if we look at, just for a few minutes, the law that we're talking about, the 2007 law, I'll just say that I'm not an expert on this, so I may have well got some things wrong, so please excuse me if I have. So if you look at the various OECD reports, the whole reform in 2007 was set off by an OECD report which noted some of the problems that were affecting the system. And these included things like that higher education staff were civil servants, so that meant that there was considerable government control over who got appointed, over dismissal, over tenure, and so on. Universities did have more autonomy than polytechnics, but even so, it wasn't that big. External stakeholders weren't that much involved. They were there, but it was unclear, I think, what their purpose was. And so that limited, it was argued, that higher education institutions' societal impact. I'm not convinced of that particular issue. but I think that was something that was relevant. The institutional election of rectors, it was argued internally, could actually encourage weak leadership, although I think that's only one reason why you get weak leadership. Using large internal bodies of staff and students for decision-making was argued to be very slow and not very transparent, and higher education institutions were seen as disengaged from outside organisations, from things like innovation and collaboration with industry, and close government interference really didn't improve that situation. So who benefited from these reforms and why? So the foundation status which that law introduced, if universities wished to apply for it and if they were eligible, didn't get a mass take-up. Of course, it's not a large number of institutions that were able to choose it anyway, but so Porto, Aveiro and Iste got foundation status in 2009, but I believe that they were promised an extra grant, which they never actually got, which is quite interesting. Minho and Lisbon Nova joined in 2015 and 2016, and then a Polytechnic, Cavada and Av joined in 2018. So it's not a large number of institutions. Now, some foundation higher education institutions made considerable use of private staffing contracts, and I'll come back to that in a minute, about what that might imply, especially for career researchers, and use salary flexibility to pay higher salaries than was allowed by the civil servant status. And I think Minho also used these arrangements to set up collaboration with industry, and including a long-running and much praised partnership with Bosch. But if you look at when they started that, it looks as though they started it before they actually took out foundation status. So it suggests that it wasn't impossible before, it was just made easier by the appointment of staff. Academic autonomy was restricted in that they had to go through accreditation, so even if they had foundation status, the accreditation of their programme still had to go ahead. And full financial autonomy was never really achieved, partly due, well, largely due to the 2008 Eurozone crisis and the kinds of austerity measures that were taken in public higher education institutions. But not all higher education institutions wanted foundation status. Some of them weren't eligible for it, and some saw it as extremely anti-collegial and a step towards privatisation. So what kind of impact did it have? Now, obviously, this is a long-running debate, and I mean, I don't necessarily agree with some of these, but some of these are in the OECD report on it. So some of the positive things, the first one of which I'm not sure I do entirely agree with, is the notion that actually relying on large numbers of people to make strategic and routine management decisions has ended, so that's a good thing. In one sense, it is if it wasn't transparent, but I've certainly worked in systems, like when I was at the UK Open University in the 1980s, Senate was massive there. It was really, really big because it was a distance teaching institution, so it had students from all over the UK, it had people in the forces from lots of other countries, and actually that worked really well. And they weren't taking routine management decisions, but the decisions they did make were actually very well supported by staff and students. So I don't always think that large groups necessarily are problematic. But of course, if you're a government trying to control institutions, then they might be seen as problematic. So the second one that comes up is that external members now have a clearer function in governance, although I'm not sure whether the people who are involved actually see that. I think they might not regard it in quite the same way, because there is that sense of just because you expect people to do things, they're not necessarily going to do them unless they're clearly directed. And also it depends where those external members come from. What they're going to do in terms of, say, people from public institutions in the community is not the same as people from large corporations or businesses, small and medium-sized businesses. There's also an argument that there's greater accountability of rectors and senior teams through network governance, but I guess that kind of depends on the context, and also whether internal stakeholders feel the accountability is to them as well. And I think that's a kind of question we have to ask about what's going on. Private law staffing contracts and salary flexibility are helpful for some institutions for things that they perhaps wouldn't have done or wouldn't have been able to do so easily before. The process for electing rectors and presidents is now a public competition that's open to both internal and external applicants. And for some foundation higher education institutions, there's some limited scope for financial autonomy, but obviously the foundation institutions don't benefit from that. If we look at the kind of negative things, then I think there are quite a lot of issues, some of which the OECD picks out, some of which they don't. I mean, one is, I think, having different rules for different universities complicates what is not a massive higher education system. So the more complicated you make it, the question is, why would you do that? And what are the benefits of having that kind of split? It seems like students, although there's kind of provision for some representation of students, like on the council and things like that, they're not much involved in higher education governance, either at the foundation institutions or at other higher education institutions. The third is a point, I don't know the answer to that, and I'm sure that if you're from Portugal you'll know, but do staff on private contracts have the same employment rights as those who are still civil servants? Because that's the potential issue. But I can see that if it allows people to be paid more money, then that may be beneficial to the institution and those people. Where do the polytechnics fit into all this? I know that they're kind of being offered things that they want, for example, to possibly have doctoral programs, although I think that not all of them would qualify at the moment, because I think you would have to, if the law was changed, they'd have to meet a standard in terms of the assessment of their research centres. Otherwise, they wouldn't be allowed to have them, I think. So that's kind of potentially important, but not necessarily going to be available to everybody. There are fewer places where staff and students can have a debate about what's going on in their institutions, and there have to be a formal mechanism. That could be informal as well. There might be different interpretations of what's going on and strategic developments at different levels, so that may get confusing. So what the kind of base level thinks might not be what people at the top think they're going to do. It's unclear if having external governors leads to wider societal economic concerns being raised. Internal members have different agendas and might have, obviously, more knowledge of the institution. So the balance of power isn't just about size, it's also about the capacity of people to speak up and what they are trying to achieve. I think also that there's an issue around kind of equality issues, because those don't seem to be addressed at any level of governance, and there are a lot of precarious jobs in all higher education institutions in the system. There's still considerable political interference in Portuguese higher education, although it's a little bit less so in the foundation institutions. So there's those are just a few things. I mean, I'm sure you can add other things to that. Okay, so let's switch now to looking at the English system. So the English system has something called risk-based quality assurance. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of this delightful breakfast cereal, haven't you? No, you probably haven't, because I think the only other country that has it is probably Australia. And the reason I think it's problematic is because it assumes that once you've decided that some kind of institution is doing well, you then leave them alone. And this has been tried in our schooling system in England too. So they go to a school, they decide it's outstanding, they then don't visit it again for about another 6 or 7 years, by which time when they go back, surprise, surprise, it's no longer outstanding. It might even be not even satisfactory. So the UK, as you saw when I put that little table up a while ago, ranks very highly in the 2011 and 2017 EUA autonomy scorecards. So that looks as though actually universities have a lot of independence to do what they want. It saw a lot of new managerial and public management innovations and developments around the primacy of management. This really started in the 1980s. There was pressure in the kind of late 1990s to early 2000s to reduce the size of governing bodies. Now, some people thought that that meant that you got more external governors. I actually think there were more external governors before that happened, but the difference was you now had a much smaller body, because the argument is that unless you had a very small body, you couldn't operate. Again, I don't necessarily think the evidence for that is in any country is quite as strong as that would appear from that kind of argument. So since 2016, there have been some very significant changes to English higher education institutions and how they're regulated and governed. And that includes the Teaching Excellence Framework. It's now called the Teaching Excellence and Student Outcomes, which is a bit of a mouthful. And there's also a new higher education regulatory body called the Office for Students, which replaced the former, much more benign Higher Education Funding Council for England. So the risk-based assurance, which they now use, is a kind of light touch activity in which the Office for Students thinks that the market will sort out all these problems. So you don't have to worry about quality assurance very much because the market will sort it out. Now that clearly is a fallacy. It doesn't sort it all out. And it was really underlined that in 2019, a very high-profile private for-profit university of the kind that the government has tried to encourage, it calls them challengers against the incumbents of the nasty state-related institutions. Greenwich School of Management went into administration overnight, and the Office for Students knew nothing about it until they found out from the administrators. And hundreds of international students were attached to this institution. Your visa as an international student is related to your institution that gives you the place in the first place. So although other universities were willing to take them, they then had to go home, reapply for a visa, and if they were lucky, go back to the second institution. So the whole thing was complete chaos, but was completely unforeseen by the Office for Students. So I do think it's quite a kind of problematic way of doing things. There's also, I suppose the other thing is to just say, and I'm sure some of you know about this already, but I think it came as quite a shock to some people in English universities, is that there's a quality assurance agency which relates to the whole of the, it relates to kind of everything. So what happened is that, it covers all 4 countries. It doesn't just cover England, but it also covers Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland. And the QAA had remained the so-called independent body which worked with the Office for Students on quality assurance. But because it doesn't conform to the European standards, the QAA was thrown out, temporarily suspended, I suppose is the technical term, from, I think it's called EQA is the initial, so it's the European Quality Assurance Register for Higher Education. And they need the approval of that in order to continue working with the other 3 countries. So they then announced that in March of this year, they are going to stop being the independent body for England, which leaves England with no independent body. No one has any idea what kind of independent body might replace it, or indeed whether it really will be independent, because you've seen the state of our political manoeuvres. I've sort of left kind of trying to work out which person is responsible for higher education, because there have been so many of them recently. It's quite hard to keep up with what they're all doing. But I just think this is a kind of actually really quite frightening thing. That, again, I think some of us could see it coming, but I think most people, including the Office for Students, didn't seem to know that it was about to happen. The other changes that have happened since 2016, there's a kind of there have been various things getting governors to be more responsible. So to produce an annual report about financial matters, that came in 2016. It obviously didn't work, however, for Greenwich School of Management, because presumably they submitted this in the relevant year. It looked okay, but it wasn't, because that's why they collapsed. And I think that means it's not a particularly reliable way of doing these things. So they also introduced a notion that governing bodies must produce a quality assurance report each year for the institution in terms of its teaching and learning, which of course then required a whole new bureaucracy, a new committee, governors being involved in it. Many governors really had not a clue about quality assurance in teaching and learning. They didn't really even understand it, but they have to sign it off. So that was an attempt, I think, to kind of say, oh, this is a really important issue at the top of the institution. But unless you've got the range of understanding of what it is that they're signing off, then that becomes quite problematic. Office for Students also thinks that, as I said earlier, that quality assurance can just mainly be left to the market. Unfortunately, I don't actually think that's the case. And unlike Scotland, the Office for Students doesn't offer any quality enhancement incentives whatsoever, I think because they don't actually believe in them. So the other kind of issue is that they have to kind of have new governance arrangements, because the students are now taking out large loans. I think now the debt levels of some former students are at the same level as they are in the US, which I think is an incredible indictment of a system that really isn't working that well, certainly not for students. And that, I think, is quite a problem. And of course, if they hadn't taken the funding for teaching away, then the students would still have had much lower fees. And also we have the Competition and Markets Authority, who's kind of breathing down the necks of the universities, saying you mustn't change anything in your curriculum or your assessment without giving lots of notice, by which they mean like, you know, a year or 18 months, because this means that you're actually breaking the rules of this competitive market. And that's quite problematic. And again, I don't know that people know about that. And then finally, there's a selection of threats to the English higher education system's autonomy that are more kind of, informal is probably the wrong word, but they're not kind of necessarily buried in kind of legislation or kind of manifestos. So, for example, in 2022, the then Universities Minister, Michelle Donnellan, wrote to all the universities, I think she wrote to them across the whole UK, not just in England, and said, you should not be applying for equality accreditation schemes anymore because this is not appropriate. And the reason she said it's not appropriate is because she feels that anything to do with accreditation, actually, in terms of equality issues, it potentially is a challenge to free speech. Now, I'm not quite sure I can see the argument about why that's the case, but clearly she could. Anyway, the universities wrote back and said, this has actually crossed a red line. It is not your place to tell us what to do in relation to things like race, in relation to gender, in relation to disability and so on. You know, we are in charge of that, not you, and we're not going to take any notice. I mean, she's no longer the Minister for Higher Education, but we have another one, and I have no idea what they think about it yet. They haven't had much time, I guess, to think about it. There's also a plan which has been floating around for some time. In fact, when Theresa May was Prime Minister, during all the kind of Brexit debates, she suggested it too, which is actually that we have too many international students, that getting rid of some of them would reduce the migration figures, because remember there's going to be an election in 2024, so they're looking to kind of get the migration figures down, and getting rid of international students is an easy way to do it because it doesn't affect the labour market. So they have suggested, I don't know if this is actually going to happen, but at one point they suggested that only the Russell Group universities, which is the elite universities, would be allowed to have them. Now this would be a massive loss to the economy. Billions of pounds. This isn't a little tiny amount of money. It would be catastrophic. And there's no evidence anywhere that the public objects to international students. I mean, most of them go straight home afterwards. And those who don't are on a very strict kind of visa which says you can stay for so long and no longer. So that is a bizarre one. It's not formalised yet, and nobody's quite knows what's happening. But also, Office for Student has very considerable powers. All English higher education institutions have to join it. The subscription is really expensive. They have to kind of accept all the kind of things that go with it. So one of the powers that the Office for Students has, which the old Higher Education Council for Higher Education in England didn't have, is a clause that says that if they do not like what an institution is doing, in the case of the established universities, they can take away the Royal Charter. Now, I think if they ever do that, there will be uproar. So I don't know if they will ever do it, but they have the power to do it. And the ex-polytechnics are mostly corporate institutions. They also have the right to take away that corporate status. Now, again, that's never been tested yet, but maybe it will be, and I think it's kind of quite a frightening thing. There's also a lot of other discussions about programs leading to low-paid jobs are to be got rid of or discouraged. Now, some of these low-paid jobs include things like nursing, social work, social care, for example. So do we want to get rid of those jobs? No, I think not. We can't afford to get rid of them. And the fact that they're badly paid is exactly what all the strikes at the moment in the UK are about. So that's another threat. The Teaching Excellence Framework has kind of long since moved well past teaching excellence. institutions have to do a self-assessment, and there's a new round has just gone ahead, so the closing date is just finished, so I don't know what the outcome is yet. At one point they were going, at the moment it's done on an institutional basis, but they trialled doing it by discipline, and actually I think they found that it was too complicated, and that it was going to take an awful lot of time and an awful lot of energy, and perhaps it wasn't worth it, so I think for the moment they've dropped that. But the fact that it's kind of largely now, they do have a kind of emphasis on inequality and progression of disadvantaged groups, so I think that bit's good, but the rest of it, there's a lot of emphasis on do your graduates go into very highly paid jobs. And of course those jobs are also important, but if you compare them to the low-paid jobs which are in the public sector in the main, I think that one can't say they're more important. And the argument is nothing to do with the actual job. The argument is they'll pay the loan quicker. And so they'll actually pay back the loan, because the evidence, not the evidence they showed when they introduced the high fees, but the evidence that now appears is that actually many students will never repay their loan. And at some point it gets wiped, but it takes a lot of years before that happens. So that, I think, is another problem. I think also that there are a couple of other things that are also going on in this sector. This month and next month, a proportion of universities have staff on strike for a total across February and March of 18 days. Now, this is a long series of strikes which started in 2018, and they were principally about a pension scheme which has got very, very low benefits and very, very high contributions, whereas it used to be quite different to that. And that I think, has unsettled the whole sector. I think the universities thought that they wouldn't strike for such a long time. Whether they will actually sustain it, I don't know, but they started this week. So that doesn't help the public opinion about universities, but on the other hand, quite a lot of students, although annoyed that they're losing teaching, also sympathise with those strikers. And then finally, you may think this is not relevant, but I think it's extremely relevant, is that the fact that people who are heads of universities in England get eye-wateringly high salaries. And I'll give you a comparison. They get more than twice what would be paid to the chief executive of a hospital. And I think that is really problematic. And because they get paid such high salaries, and this has had a lot of publicity, as it seems that some of them sat on the committees that agreed this, that actually the public is thinking, universities are quite problematic. Now, you might say that these are all kind of quite minor things, but actually I think that they're quite major in terms of the Office for Students' Control. And the reason that I introduced that table quite a long time ago is that if you look at that, all right, it was done in 2017, but some of those things were already in place, like the Teaching Excellence Framework. It suggests that this is a very autonomous system, which therefore probably has autonomous governance. What I'm saying is that there are lots of things being done to show that that's no longer the case. But you would not guess that or be able to predict it by using either new management, new public management, or new managerialism, because actually they've worked around that, but they're not part of it. And that's why I think looking at the kind of networked governance that is around, external as well as internal, it's not just what's inside those institutions, it's what else is linked to. And I think that shows you that it's no longer possible to use those kind of institutional autonomy scales and to say, if you read off from these institutions in this country have a lot of autonomy and those don't. It's much, much more complicated. So just a kind of few thoughts in finishing. So new public management and new managerialism are obviously long-standing in higher education institutions, and there are lots of varieties of governance and that they've spawned, as well as varieties of other things that they do. And I think obviously that sits alongside higher levels of external and managerial governance dominance. It sits alongside a decline in collegial-based decision-making and enhancement of the role of external stakeholders. But you can't predict the exact arrangements that will occur in a particular system just using that theory, which is why, although I spent some time on it at the beginning, I'm not sure it's that helpful in terms of the kind of decisions and thoughts that we want to have. The presentation explored institutional autonomy as well as governance and autonomy, and then tried to compare them. And I know the comparisons kind of a tricky one, but I just thought it's quite, because it's so different. From one, you think this, you know, if you look at the Portuguese system, it appears that there isn't that much autonomy in some areas, whereas the English one looks as though there's a lot. But if you look at where the English one is now, then that's not the case. But some of those things still wouldn't come up in that survey, because governance is one little aspect of the organisational criteria, so it wouldn't appear even now. And I think it just shows that there are all sorts of things that can affect governance arrangements, and they're not just straightforward decisions to change the system. So you can see something like an economic recession can have a massive effect on the autonomy of universities, whereas the English case is marked with kind of right-wing ideology, free speech arguments. We've got free speech coming out of our ears. We know that some universities in England that are seen to be left-wing, some Tory MPs are tracking staff that they think they would like to get rid of because they teach things like critical race theory. Now, that is an extraordinary situation. But that doesn't show up in any of those EUA statistics, and I don't think it would now. But it is, I think, quite worrying. So if we look at kind of the situation in England, then I think it's no longer a system that has very much autonomy, but it's dressed up to look as though it has. So the message is just look very carefully at both the informal things that are going on and the formal things. Thank you.